Willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 31 of my battle series of video. This video is the last of my official Polish historical campaign videos, and this will go through the initial 14 days of this campaign using a map format. I'll also be providing a brief overview of the combat strengths of the standard division brigades of both sides used in this campaign. Before I dive into the maps, I wanted to provide a quick overview of why I created these videos. Back in the late 1990s, I wanted to create a board game about the Polish campaign. In order to do a credible job, I conducted a significant amount of research which resulted in a draft book on the subject. This video is based on that written draft book. I created this draft book or document in an attempt to understand the campaign in a highly technical manner. I have many books on the subject, but none ever provide me with the details I desired. Even the sections which deals with the campaign can often be hard to understand in terms of what is occurring in a holistic manner. While Guderian was driving deep into Poland, what else was happening is a good example of what I felt was missing, and many of the historical documents didn't really present the campaign in the manner that I desired. Of course, I needed this information in order to create a board game, which is a rather esoteric sort of objective which most people don't share. However, what I found interesting about this analysis is that it actually changed my view of the campaign. Previously, I thought that the German way of war and highly experienced and prepared army was the main reason for the quick campaign. But after I did the research, I realised that that was not really the reason for the rapidity of this campaign. The Germans won as quickly as they did because they simply overwhelmed the Polish army. It's long been an established military maxim that a 3-to-1 odds will normally give you victory. The normal issue is what numbers are we comparing in order to arrive at the odds, but the basic principle of 3-to-1 to give you victory is a fairly sound one. In order to give me core numbers which I could try and calculate the odds from, I used an old SPI, the SPI company developed back in the 1970s, to give my military formations a combat value based on the old British and US mad minute concept. I think SPI call this CQs, although I'm uncertain what the acronym means, possibly quantitative qualifiers or something, comparative qualifiers or something of that nature. When I did this, it was quickly obvious the Germans had significantly more than 3-to-1 odds advantage on the front line on the 1st of September. Perhaps if the Polish had fully mobilised, they could have had a better chance against the Germans, and in my playtesting of my board game, this was certainly the case. But even fully mobilised, the Germans still had an odds of at least 2-to-1, if not a bit more, and the Germans had the all-important, fully mechanised divisions which formed corps, which were the key of the rapid German advance. I have to admit the Polish did have its share of motorised forces, but they were all distributed throughout the army. Perhaps if the Polish had converted all the Polish cavalry brigades into mechanised brigades, which is what they were intending to do, and then formed them into corps-sized formations, which I'm not sure if that's what they would have done, then they would have had a counter to the German panzer and motorised divisions. I had a better time playtesting a potential Polish-Soviet conflict in 1939. In this case, the Polish could easily defend against the Soviet attack, although I expect the Soviets would have sent more forces, which would have eventually overwhelmed the Polish. However, the whole point is if the invasion could not succeed quickly, support from the West would have made victory that much more difficult, if not impossible. The key point here was whoever was invading Poland had to succeed quite rapidly before France and Britain mobilised its economic and military power to assist. On a slightly different topic, what really surprised me concerning these videos is the high level of interest in the videos, which I must admit I did not expect. The view count was surprisingly high, although the average view time was lower. Even factoring that, these videos seemed unusually popular compared with my standard videos. While I must admit most of my standard videos are designed for uber-nerd gamers, as they're designed to promote the hobby of wargaming, but in this series of videos, that I presented here is nonetheless designed for gamers, which may not be a format a layperson would find entertaining regardless. I noticed the same thing occurred in my science fiction channel when I created a more entertaining video series on Star Trek rather than a technical video on the same subject. The view rate went up a hell of a lot. Reality always tends to surprise me. One other side issue, or side thing that I noticed from my sci-fi channel was that you had to be very careful with the title, that is to avoid clickbait titles. When I reviewed the Star Trek episode called What a Little Girl's Made Of, my view count went up a lot, but it was not the views I really wanted. I suppose in the end it's not the views that you really should look at, it's the watch time. I have to admit I have no intention of creating general historical videos even due to the popularity of this series of videos. I'll leave that to others who can do it a lot better than I. I've listed some of my favourite history channels here for those interested if they want to get a more general history type video rather than my rather technical videos which are designed to promote the hobby of board gaming or figure gaming. Let's now dive into the maps. The first point is the maps I'm using here was the template for my original board game, so it does have a board gamey feel to it. It was also designed to be converted into a figure gaming playing area format, especially if using a set of rules which support battalion size elements. The second point to note is a lack of detailed information of the exact movement of all the divisions and brigades in the campaign. I had to guess a lot of the positions based on the overall corps or army movements. I also had a lot of trouble converting accounts, that is historical accounts, in something which can be displayed in a map. I'm not sure why this was the case, but some of the accounts seemed not to make sense, or perhaps the problem was with me, I'm not exactly certain. I'll also be dividing the maps into a north and south, with some overlap in the centre. So let's now start my map-based journey into this interesting topic, which is covering the war day by day in a map format. I'll be starting with the northern section of the campaign. On the 1st of September, the main action was all about the 3rd Panzer Division and its supporting motorised divisions. This Panzer Division found a gap and took full advantage of it, while the motorised divisions had a much more difficult time getting through the Polish front line. Over in East Prussia, the Germans also had an initial difficult time getting through the Polish front line. On the 2nd of September, the 3rd Panzer Division had cut off the Polish in the corridor, resulting in all forces that were cut off being ordered to retreat. On the rest of the front line, the Polish defences were holding, even if some of the formations were being forced back. By the 3rd of September, the Polish were in general retreat, especially in the Polish corridor. The first pocket in the north was forming in the Polish corridor, which resulted in the destruction of 2 Polish infantry divisions and 1 cavalry brigade. On the 4th of September, the Polish forces facing East Prussia were withdrawn to a fortified position, and in the Polish corridor there was a lot of desperate fighting as the Polish were attempting to restore a front line and break out of the pocket. On the 5th of September, the fighting continued in the Polish corridor, while north of Warsaw, the Polish withdrawal continued in reasonable order with the Germans in hot pursuit. The 5th of September was similar to the 5th of September. Ferocious fighting was still occurring in the Polish corridor, and the Polish withdrawal above Warsaw was continuing in good order. On the 6th of September, the Polish started withdrawing its central forces on the left here towards Warsaw. The major event on the 6th was the Germans started to pivot east of Warsaw, where the Polish defences were weaker. The Polish were desperately moving forces in to bolster this position. By the 7th of September, the Polish forces in the Polish corridor had collapsed, and the Germans were driving east into East Prussia. Above Warsaw, the fighting was becoming more vicious as the Germans were attempting to outflank the Polish defensive line. The Polish forces in the centre were rapidly trying to withdraw to Warsaw, which you can see on the left. On the 8th of September, the Germans were rapidly moving the 3rd and 10th Panzer Division and the 2nd and 20th Motorised Division into East Prussia, or well east into East Prussia. The Polish withdrawal was continuing towards Warsaw. Above Warsaw, the Polish line was holding but was under severe pressure, with the Polish right flank beginning to collapse. On the 9th of September, the Germans had broken the Polish position above Warsaw and were driving down into the rear of Warsaw. Further north, the German mechanised divisions were sent onto a wide outflanking move towards Brest. Meanwhile, down south, the Polish launched their counter-offensive in an attempt to cut off the German armed forces which had reached the outskirts of Warsaw. On the 10th of September, the Polish counterattack continued, and while initially the Germans ignored it, by the end of the day it was obvious that this was much more serious than originally thought. The Polish line above Warsaw was holding in its new river position. The German outflanking moves, which originated from East Prussia, was hitting real opposition but was making good headway nonetheless. I often wonder why the Germans felt this advance to Brest was so important. They had pocketed the bulk of the Polish army west of Warsaw, but the Germans thought most of these formations were already in Warsaw, or even east of it, so possibly expected more opposition in that city. This would have required this outflanking manoeuvre, and this is why I think they undertook it. On the 11th of September, the German forces driving down behind Warsaw achieved major breakthroughs. The Polish forces directly above Warsaw were forced back into fortification and were effectively cut off. On the other hand, west of Warsaw, the Germans were sending forces back from Warsaw to contain the Polish counterattack, so the position there was less desperate for the Polish. On the 12th of September, the Germans continued their rapid drive down to Brest, cutting off the Polish from the eastern part of Poland, or the Polish forces. Closer to Warsaw, the inner northern flank was slowly advancing towards the rear of Warsaw. Meanwhile, west of Warsaw, the main Polish counterattack was called off and the Polish launched a minor attack further north of this position in an attempt to break through to Warsaw. On the 13th of September, the Germans continued their rapid drive towards Brest and were slowly advancing to cut off Warsaw from the rest of Poland. In the west, the Polish attempted to break out continued, with only a small number of formations making it to Warsaw, possibly 2 divisions. The rest of the Polish army ended up being in the largest pocket of the entire war, continuing to resist. On the 14th of September, the Germans had reached the outskirts of Brest, and while it would take a further 5 days of fighting to take the city, they had broadly achieved their objective. Further west of Brest, a small Polish pocket had formed. To the west of Warsaw, the Kutno pocket continued to resist the Germans, which did occupy most of the German forces for quite a while after this date. That pretty much completes the northern section of the front line. Let's now focus on the southern front. Moving down to the southern sector, the German attacks on the 1st of September were initially resisted with no major breakthroughs. There was significant fighting in several areas, specifically in front of the 4th Panzer, the 2nd and 3rd Light, and the 5th Panzer Division. Further down south in the mountains, another major mechanised attack was being spearheaded by the 2nd Panzer and the 4th Light Division, and this was being held back, at least initially. On the 2nd of September, the 5th Panzer Division finally managed to break through and drive deep into the Polish rear. In other areas of German attacks, such as the 4th Panzer and the 2nd and 3rd Light Divisions, and the 2nd Panzer, the Polish were resisting, although the 1st Panzer had managed to exploit a gap in the line and was also driving deep into the Polish rear. The Polish line lacked much depth, which opened it up to these types of penetrations. When the Germans struck the main elements of a division, the Polish could resist for a while, but the gaps were not able to stop the movement of an entire Panzer division for long, if at all. By the 3rd of September, the 1st and 4th Panzer Division had broken clean through and were driving deep into the Polish rear. Further south, the 5th Panzer Division continued its advance, although it was now pivoting south in order to hit the Polish rear in an attempt to create another pocket. After these breakthroughs, the Polish forces in front of Krakow began to withdraw to a better defensive position. Further south in the mountains, the 2nd Panzer and the 4th Light had managed to break through, with the 2nd Panzer Division outflanking the Polish defenders. Luckily for the Polish 10th Mechanised Brigade arrived in time to stop a complete breakthrough. On the 4th of September, the entire Polish front line was in retreat, with the Germans successfully conducting 2 deep penetration attacks against the Polish line. So far, the Polish retreat was in good order, but with the German 1st and 4th Panzer Division deep into the Polish position was rapidly falling apart. The main objective in the south was to pocket the Polish forces in front of Krakow. On the 5th of September, the Polish had adopted a new defensive position in front of Lodz, this is in the north, but with the German army driving up north into the rear of the city, this was not a viable defensive position. Down south, the Polish had just managed to stop the 5th Panzer Division from taking Krakow and blocking their retreat, but the retreat of Polish forces began to cause the Polish formations to fall apart. Basically, the Germans had failed in creating a pocket, but the Polish forces which did retreat did not retreat in particularly good order. On the 6th of September, the German 1st Panzer Division had reached the outskirts of Radom, where they were attacked. This halted the German advance for about a day. South of this position, the 2nd and 3rd Light were advancing deep into the Polish rear. Down at Krakow, the Polish had managed to escape the German pocket, but only with heavy losses. The entire Polish line between Krakow and Lodz was basically wide open. On the 7th of September, the German 4th and 1st Panzer Division had all but cut Lodz off from the rest of Poland. This resulted in another retreat by the Polish forces west of Lodz, back into the city of Lodz. Down south, the survivors from Krakow were streaming east with the Germans in hot pursuit. On the 8th of September, the German 1st and 4th Panzer Division resumed its advance towards Warsaw, cutting Lodz fully off. The Polish were desperately defending Lodz, but were being encircled. Further south, the Germans continued their advance towards Lwów, with the terrain and skillful defence by the Polish slowing them down somewhat, but not excessively. While not exactly a rout, it certainly looked very close to one. On the 9th of September, Lodz was taken and the Germans drove up towards Warsaw. The Polish were beginning to form a thin line around Radom, but the German 2nd and 3rd Light Division penetrated south of the town. Further south, the advance towards Lwów continued unabated. On the 10th of September, the thin Polish line south of Warsaw was broken and the Polish forces retreated to fortified cities, forming two pockets. Further south, the Germans began to swing up north with part of their forces while maintaining their advance to Lwów with the rest of their forces. On the 11th of September, there were two Polish pockets at Radom. They were fully surrounded, but they continued to resist the Germans. Further south, the German advance continued with only minimal resistance on the Vistula. The 12th of September mainly saw fighting around the Polish pockets in the north and the continued advance of the Germans in the southern part. By the 13th of September, the two pockets had been reduced and the Germans took up position on the Vistula and sent additional forces north towards Warsaw. Down south, the Germans had almost reached Lwów. The Polish were retreating towards the Romanian border, where some formations did escape over. On the 14th of September, another pocket formed in a position roughly equal between Warsaw and Lwów, and the Germans reached the outskirts of Lwów. For all purposes, there was no front line to speak of, only pockets that were slowly being reduced. That ends the campaign, and that was the kind of analysis that I did in order for me to design a board game. And as you can see, it gives you a better view of actually what occurred than possibly, in a holistic manner, than possibly reading many of the historical accounts. The next thing I wanted to cover is the combat effectiveness of the opposing sides. I'll not go into the details of how I achieved these values, but I've basically or simply used a set of World War II micro-armour rules, point systems, to calculate the points values of the divisions and brigades which fought in this campaign. I'm uncertain how accurate this is, but I have to assume it gives us a reasonable view of the combat effectiveness of the various formations in question. First, a quick description of these charts that I'm showing now. The first field that you see here tells us what formation we're looking at. In this case, a full-strength regular Polish infantry division. This column here lists the various regiments and battalions which comprise the divisional-sized unit. Company-sized formations are grouped under the divisional headquarters row. This column provides us with the full points value of each of the formations. In this case, a Polish infantry regiment in a Polish infantry division. This has a value of 1,346 points. This column is not really critical, but tells us what this formation mainly consisted of. As you'd expect, a Polish infantry battalion is considered an infantry formation, INF. The number next to it is a simplified strength grade, which in this case is a 1. While the value of, let's say, 369 will give us the most accurate value, large numbers can cause us to lose track of the big picture. Thus, the simple number of 1 in this particular case, which we won't use to any large extent in this video. The last column is a set of values for this formation which is used in a set of figure gaming rules, which could also be used for a board game. Let's first compare the infantry divisions of the Germans and the Polish. If we look at the infantry regiments, we can see the German infantry regiments have a high value, mainly due to a high level of manpower. It's not a massive difference, but it does show a greater size and strength of the German infantry regiment. Strangely enough, the Polish artillery regiment is reasonably equivalent to the German artillery regiment, but the compensation does indicate some differences. The German artillery batteries were all indirect fire weapons, while the Polish contained the 75mm field gun, which could be used in an indirect role, but also in a direct role. This gave the Polish division significant anti-tank capability, which proved very useful when the Germans launched all-out tank attacks. The German infantry division contained significantly more support formations. This was especially the case for anti-aircraft assets. The Germans also contained a large and powerful engineer battalion. Overall, while the German infantry division is larger and more powerful, it was not really overwhelmingly so. When we come to the mechanised formations, the story was very different. While it's unfair to compare the Polish mech brigade against the German panzer division, it was the closest comparison which existed in this campaign. If we look at the motorised regiment, the Germans have a significant advantage, almost 2-to-1, over the motorised regiment in the poor old Polish mechanised brigade. The Polish mechanised brigade rapidly had additional independent tank battalions attached to it during the campaign, which gave them additional armour, but it was still significantly less than the German panzer division by many orders of magnitude. I'll not go into the detail of the structure, but a final point was the Germans had a lot more armour divisions than the Polish had mech brigades. The final comparison is the Polish cavalry brigades, which acted as mobile infantry, which could be roughly equivalent to the German motorised divisions. Once again, the German motorised regiments were orders of magnitude more powerful than the horse-mounted infantry in the Polish brigades, even if we include the motorised battalion. If we then look at the artillery story is even worse, with the cavalry brigade containing only a single 75mm gun battalion. I have to admit these guns were very effective in an anti-tank role, but this formation lacked the indirect fire punch required to be effective against a German division if they wanted to launch an attack. That pretty much completes my historical breakdown. Now let's move into the alternative history world. That is, what could have occurred that would have changed the result of this campaign? Personally, I feel there was really little hope, but a few possible scenarios could be considered. The first scenario to consider is an all-out air assault by the Western Allies against Germany. This is a very low probability event and would have resulted in very heavy Western Allied losses, but could have distracted the Germans somewhat. It may have resulted in most of the German fighter forces, particularly the Bf-109s, moving west. However, without a ground assault, the Germans would not have needed to move any of its bomber assets west. The second scenario is a rapid French mobilisation. The French waited until the 3rd to mobilise and mobilised very slowly. If they had at least mobilised on the 1st and done so a bit quicker, it could have launched a much more serious Saar offensive 3 days earlier than it did. While this may not have broken through the German line, if there was heavy Allied air attacks supporting this, the Germans may have been forced to redeploy bombers west. However, I personally feel none of these scenarios would have made a significant difference. Perhaps it could have delayed the Polish collapse, but with the Soviet moving in from the east, this was not going to really make a major difference for at least poor old Poland. Possibly a more significant change to history would be for the Polish to defend a much shorter line and for mobilisation to occur as rapidly as possible. With full mobilisation behind a better defensive position, the Germans would have only had about a 2-to-1 advantage, if not less. So I would expect a much longer and harder fight. If the Western Allies had launched a major attack on the west and the Polish had managed to hold the Germans back, the Soviets may have delayed their invasion. This is the real long shot, and I doubt if the Soviets would have delayed. But in an all-out best alternative history world, we can hope that this possibly is possible. As you've worked out by now, it's hard to see any road which leads to the Poland holding out long enough to allow the West to make a major attack in the West, and a difference. The tragedy of Poland had its roots in earlier actions by the West, which is outside of the scope of our alternate history analysis. And so we come to an end of my last historical video, part 31 of my military history video covering the Polish campaign in 1939, which in this case covered the war day by day in map format and also gave an analysis of the various formations opposing each other. Alle guten Dingen kommen zu einem Ende.